Hey everyone, welcome back. A Toxin Tenet Livia arrived with Ergo Glass this cycle, so I thought it was finally time to pick it up. There aren't that many two-handed Nikanas currently in the game, with just Tatsu and Pennant so far. Now we have another one to add into the mix, and it fills a niche that we've been missing sorely. This is Tenet Livia, a slash-focused two-handed Nikana and the first of its kind. While it doesn't have any special quirk like the heavy attack projectiles from Agendus or Grigori, nor the weird slam mechanics of Exec, it instead has top-tier base weapon stats. It also has the Granum Attaché system, which preserves the combo duration while the weapon is holstered, so this is perfect for endurance runs as well as stuff like Disruption where you might have a lot of downtime between uses. This weapon has 90% slash weight, identical to the one-handed Nikana family currently in the game. For a weapon that hits so hard and the potential of slash and condition overload, I actually prefer lower elemental bonus on this weapon. While the proc size offsets the loss of slash procs from dilution, if you go higher elemental bonus, the real question in practice isn't the size of the slash procs, as you clearly saw in the intro, but rather if you procced any slash at all. If you do proc slash, the target is as good as dead, regardless of damage output. Hence, this 49% toxin I picked up, honestly I would have preferred it to be 25%. But that's entirely up to you, and this is just my personal take. It has a solid 28% critical and status chance split, which, while not amazing in either category, is more than enough and very respectable and usable. Combined with its favorable IPS split, this makes it the first two-handed Nikana that can make good use of slash procs even on light attacks and doesn't need the stance's single forced slash at the end of the neutral E. It is also by far the highest base damage two-handed Nikana, even at just 25% elemental bonus, which makes up for its slightly lower CC and CD compared to Pennant. This makes it competitive to Pennant even in heavy attack builds, despite Pennant's passive. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Pennant's passive actually needs direct kills to proc, and slash kills from the DOT of the heavy will not trigger stacks for it. From my understanding, this makes Livia slightly inferior in areas where Pennant can still outright kill on the heavy, but the actual on-hit damage output is nearly the same. By being useful as both a light attack and heavy two-handed Nikana, in my eyes, this makes Livia the best in class, since slash DOTs are typically overkill anyways. Now let's take a closer look at the builds. First, we'll take a look at the independent 12x light attack build. This is a setup that doesn't care about primers or anything else on your loadout. I'm slotting condition overload because your odds of proccing two statuses is basically guaranteed. The weapon has 151.2% status at 12x combo and slash with viral both carrying high weights, so you will generally match prime pressure point after 1 or 2 hits. There's the potential to proc impact or puncture also, albeit low. Threshing Grain, the neutral E, also has force impact on the first hit of the combo, therefore CO will easily overshadow prime pressure point in practice. But let's go over the stance more later. Blood Rush, on the other hand, will push this weapon to 151.2% crit. Because we're focusing so much on slash, I've opted for primed smites on this build to double dip the DOT since the weapon isn't being built for raw damage. If you don't want to run the primed smite, which increases your total damage by 2.4 times with just this one mod, I would recommend Gladiator Might. This will improve your crit damage noticeably, but also push your CC up to 182% at 12x combo and significantly improve your odds of orange crits. If you have another Gladiator mod somewhere else on your loadout, the CC will now pass 200% and you will only see oranges. Primed Reach is pretty solid mod on two-handed Nikanas because they only have 2.5 meter base range. They also have a high follow-through stat of 0.7. This is quite favorable because the second enemy hit will still take 49% damage, then the third 34.3%. If this was a stat of 0.6 instead, it would already be much worse at just 36% damage taken by the second enemy, so we can definitely make use of that range here. Organ Shatter is standard for crit damage, and I've opted for Vicious Frost to accompany our innate toxin for that sweet viral with just one mod slot. It is remaining unranked to preserve the higher slash weight on the weapon. Remember, it isn't about how big our slash procs are, but just whether we proc slash or not. Most of our status chances coming from Weeping Wounds anyways. Alternatively, if you pick up a cold Livia, you can run Proton Snap to make viral and 200% status that is otherwise unreachable. The 50% status from the mods it gives is flat status and not mod percent status, but I wouldn't use that build personally because it adds a lot of toxin and dilutes your slash. Primed Fury is mandatory in my opinion on this build because of the stance. If anything, I actually doubled up on this, and I'm also running Arcane Strike on the Warframe for even more attack speed. I definitely feel like two-handed Nikanas really benefit from this. Now let's test this thing out. For the massive bleeding potential, I'm instead going to be testing this on Drakkar Manic Bombards, as slash procs hurt a lot. Now let's dive in and slash them a few times. Easy peasy. Now you may think this is really good because of how quickly they died. Some of you who don't use two-handed Nikanas may have missed this, and I'm sure anyone that uses Tatsu or Pennant does feel this. The Wise Razor stance feels incredibly clunky to use. It was perfect on release and actually became worse somehow with Melee 3.0. Then they switched the swirl attack to the end of Threshing Grain and moved the vertical swing to the front at update 29.5. This makes it feel very disjointed each time you move to a new group of enemies. You can just start with a forward E combo instead, which does do a nice horizontal swing for multi-hits and lets it feel a lot better, but even this swing has a short wind-up to it and it makes it somewhat slow to use, and while yes, it does help the fact it doesn't change how you still need to go through this slow vertical swing when you transition into the E combo with a tiny hitbox. It doesn't flow well either, leading off the final spiral when you loop the combo back and completely ruins the animation. Look, if you end the spiral here, there's this spin animation at the end that could have been used to lead into the vertical swing, which could have had an AoE effect and better multipliers with much more damage. Instead, it just cuts very jarringly into the swing again when you restart the E combo. I really don't like the stance on the two-handed Nikanas ever since these changes and would prefer to just not even use them. The slow first swing is the reason I feel I absolutely have to run both Prime Fury and Arcane Strike to get past that slow start into the rest of the combo. It ruins the flow of the stance in my opinion now and just makes it super awkward to play with. If anything, just like me, you may want to just completely disregard and remove the stance since you'll have enough capacity anyways from the 5 Forma. The weapon has such high slash weight, it doesn't really need the 4 slash procs in the stance, and heavy attacks are universal 4 slash on two-handed Nikanas even without Wise Razor. The stanceless E combo is identical to Wise Razor's forward E cutting thrice. While it doesn't have the whirlwind on the last hit like Threshing Grain, every single swing is horizontal and flows well to each other. The DPS is about 1/4 lower, but the better control of hitboxes in my eyes just makes it better. Wise Razor is such a butchered stance at the moment, it doesn't even have an E block combo and just uses the E combo if you do that. The forward block combo is incredibly awkward as well and doesn't really have a use. Maybe against single targets for 4 slash slam and lifted status, but in normal gameplay this is incredibly impractical. You can just use the heavy swing for 4 slash anyways. I'm just waiting on DE to add a new two-handed Nikana stance because until then I think I'm just gonna play stanceless. Now let's take a look at the next build, the pure /12x light build. All that's changed is we dropped Vicious Frost for Gladiator Might to focus on more damage output. We're outsourcing our Viral to our Primer or Panzer this way. The Panzer is once again optional but strongly recommended. If you don't want to run it, you can take Spring Loaded Blade for even more range to 7.5, or Sacrificial Steel to hit 243.6% critical chance for half reds. The innate pure toxin damage is also handy for killing Corpus units outright without having to change your build. Otherwise you can just replace Gladiator Might or the Prime Smite for Prime Fever Strike if you really want to. Beyond that, the playstyle of this build is pretty similar to the last. This is the primer build I'm using. It's just a generic zero form primer build for Epitaph and procs Viral, Radiation, Cold, and Blast. If you hit them directly, it'll also proc Impact, Puncture, and Slash. You just prime the enemies as needed and then hack away. They do die a bit faster this time since I'm using external primer instead of the weapon itself, and it procs so many statuses it makes up for the delay before you hit. But this isn't that different from your typical meta melee playstyle. For a two-handed Nikana though, this is a first as Pennant is heavily impact focused and Tatsu doesn't have the stat distributions required to run a combo build. Now how about our final build, the 12x heavy? This is where things get a bit interesting. You can choose to run either CO or Sacrificial Pressure here, as it's entirely dependent on your playstyle and whether you want to prime enemies or not. What's important is the two-handed Nikanas have a 4 slash on the heavy attack, meaning Weeping Wounds isn't needed. The favorable slash distribution of Tenet Livia is also no longer as important. 12x heavy builds do so much damage that if it has 4 slash, the armor ignore DOT will never fail to instantly kill opponents once it starts to tick. This is your pretty generic 12x heavy build, with the only difference between a 2x heavy and a 12x heavy being running Reflex Coil for 90% attack efficiency on Zenrik with Inner Might instead of Corrupt Charge. However, Corrupt Charge is definitely viable too, as you do have Force Slash and you would swap out Blood Rush for Gladiator Might in that case. You would only be sitting at 154% crit chance though. At 12x on this build, the weapon sits at 274.4% crit chance, and you're guaranteed to see only reds if you have a Gladiator mod elsewhere on your loadout. Honestly, you could drop Prime Smite if you don't want to run it for Gladiator Might and Sweet Force Reds. Just note that you'll be giving up a 2.4x slash DOT multiplier if you do this. The weapon has 0.7 heavy windup by default, so slotting both Killing Blow and Amalgam Organ Shatter lets us cut this all the way down to 0.3. It feels incredibly responsive now, and finally, with a 0.7 follow through stat, Prime Breach lets you kill many enemies at once reliably with a single swing. Now let's test the Prime Smite setup against these Drakkar Manic Bombards. And look at that, I killed all 4 of them. The 4th enemy only takes 24% damage, but that's still enough to kill them with the slash DOTs. The swing is incredibly responsive itself and is very quick and covers a wide horizontal area. Now let's see what happens if I prime them. Well, there's your multi-million slash ticks I advertised. Alongside Agendus, this is probably the best Tenet Melee to use for general play, and killing enemies with lead attacks while also having an extremely strong heavy attack. It isn't as clunky as Agendus and has less range, but definitely gets the job done and is viable all the way to level cap so long as you can actually hit slash on your enemies. While the perk of Pennant on heavy kills lets its bonus attack speed pull ahead, you can see there isn't that much of a difference with how quick I can still pull out the heavy here, and you will also reach a point where the passive isn't easy to proc anymore since it doesn't include slash DOTs for the proc requirement, and Tenet Livia will now break even. All things considered, I would say Livia is definitely the current best in class 2-handed Nikana and totally worth picking up. If you want to go a slightly different route and wonder how it handles heat DOTs, well, let's just say the slash ticks give a pretty good example of how strong heat inherent on this weapon's heavy attacks could be. I narrow it down to Toxin Livia and Heat Livia being the 2 top picks. Electric isn't really worth it since the weapon lacks AoE and has follow through, so isn't as good for ensnared groups. Feel free to try it though if you want. If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like, or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. 79.5% of you are not subscribed, and I'm trying my best to get you new information out always as soon as possible, like I've done with covering the Tempestari and the Sisters of Parvos updates. Stick around if you want to see interesting memes and builds on a nearly daily basis. I'm also preparing to get you info out once more new war info drops. You don't want to miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and see you all next time.